We are recording. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to this week's episode of Out in Zion. This is part 2 of a 2-part series addressing questions about sexual orientation change efforts, or you might think of it in terms of reparative therapy, conversion therapy, or other modalities that people have attempted as a way to diminish, reduce, or completely get rid of their same-sex attraction. And the thing that has, we'll get to why we're talking about it, but first, everybody should introduce themselves. So, everybody just give us your name and what you're doing, real fast.
I'm Josh Weed, in a mixed orientation marriage, and I'm a gay Mormon.
I'm Jay. I live in Salt Lake. I'm a gay partnered, formerly LDS man.
I am Laura Doolin. I am a lifelong member of the church who's also gay and in a mixed orientation marriage and a therapist, and I'm happy to be here.
I'm Tom, also gay and active in church.
And I'm Kendall Wilcox, and gay, Mormon, and super single. So, the topic that we're going to talk about tonight is efforts that people have made or continue to make to change, reduce, diminish, or get rid of their same-sex attraction or sexual orientation. And it's been in the news a lot lately in the gay Mormon world because of a trial that took place in New Jersey where people who were practicing certain efforts around changing sexual orientation were found to be guilty of consumer fraud, and it's had fallout in the gay Mormon community in many different ways, with some organizations like North Star being implicated for their affiliation with the organization that was found to be guilty of consumer fraud, and that the messages have been a bit unclear in the Mormon community around who endorses or doesn't endorse, or why do we sustain or not sustain or subscribe to these different types of modalities meant to diminish, change, or even reduce or get rid of our same-sex attraction. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If you haven't, you should probably listen to the first part of this conversation where we talked about one of the main motivations for why people do seek after these types of interventions is because we generally, as a gay Mormon, experience our same-sex attraction as unwanted. It doesn't fit into the plan, and so if somebody offers and holds out hope that we can get rid of it, why wouldn't we try it in good conscience? But what we found, well, again, you should go listen to that other episode and see how we all processed that experience throughout our lives. We're picking the conversation up from today in our lives, meaning the group as a whole that are part of this conversation tonight. We experience our same-sex attraction or our sexual orientation as not as unwanted, but we're okay with it. We're good with it. We're even, I think we could say, happy to be gay. And we haven't, or at least, we don't currently resort to or subscribe to any of these sort of sexual orientation change efforts that are held out there that are very prominent in the gay Mormon or same-sex attracted and Mormon community, like Journey into Manhood, which is the number one, and we all do not subscribe to them for various reasons. So, and the reasons, the lists are long. So we're just going to jump right into the deep end in terms of, and it's going to be a very broad question, and then I'm going to do some follow-up, but why don't we, or why don't you, each of you, currently subscribe to or participate in these sexual orientation change efforts like those that are engaged in something like Journey into Manhood? And if you don't know what Journey into Manhood is, listeners, on our website we'll have a link to them so you can learn all about them. But yeah, why don't we? Why don't we subscribe to this stuff?
I can jump in. I don't. I have pretty strong feelings about it, about my disavowal of reparative therapy, both personal and professional reasons. So personally, as I was describing in the last episode, I had participated in reparative therapy, and the promises underlying that therapy, which is the promise of orientational change. It is this ever-present idea that if you do certain things, your sexual orientation will shift. That promise was not true. That promise isn't true.
Why do you say that?
Statistically or otherwise. Why do I say that? There's anecdotal reasons and there are statistical reasons. The science is not really incredibly solid. There have been studies that have demonstrated a lack of change, but then there are people that cite certain things that indicate otherwise. A lot of my personal views come from a very anecdotal place where I've just met and talked to and had lots of experiences with lots and lots and lots of gay Mormons who have wanted to change and no one can. And then, of course, ultimately for me, it comes down to my personal experience, which is essentially I did all of the things of the formula and it does not work. I shouldn't say all of the things of the formula, but I did many, many of the things that are at least religiously prescribed, and it did not, in even a little bit, change my sexual orientation. And so on that personal level, I strongly disavow reparative therapy. But then also just there is a lot of research that indicates the level to which it is damaging to clients, and you can see why. If you are promised a certain result for doing certain things, and then that result proves to be elusive, that will make somebody feel like they have failed. And that's not good for the self-esteem. So,
did you experience that?
I didn't, actually. I more see that clinically. When I work with gay Mormons, a lot of them have that feeling of disappointment. So I experienced a lot of disillusion, but for whatever reason, I was always on some levels okay with the fact that I was gay. But there are people who are filled with shame at the fact that their religious efforts to repair their sexual orientation didn't work. Because if it doesn't work, it means that you didn't pray hard enough or didn't do all the things well enough, or you just weren't good enough, or maybe you're just deep down, you are broken, whereas all the other people who are allegedly successful are not broken. So because of these very fundamental ideas that undergird reparative therapy, I think it's really important. I view it as being very important to educate people about why reparative therapy is problematic. I think that there are some, I always hesitate to say this, but I think that there are some principles within reparative therapy that have some merit. Specifically, some of the ideas around attachment and around healing attachment wounds, some of those ideas have merit and I think have applicability in the social sciences. But that it means nothing when the undergirding is a false claim. I can see why they were convicted of consumer fraud. You're promising something that you cannot deliver on, and that is, in essence, at least as I understand it, I'm no lawyer, but I mean, I think that it would be consumer fraud. So anyway, that's my take on things.
No, this is good. And so for you, the most fundamental reason is because it sounds like you are convinced both personally and from the science that sexual orientation does not generally change for most human beings. And so nobody should promise that it does, or even that it diminishes or reduces or in any way. And so I want to open the question up again to the rest of the group, and we're going to get back to some of those specifics that you were referencing, Josh, that were not so good, and that also that can be good, right? That you do feel comfortable with. We'll get to those in a minute, but I want to open it up to everybody else about this question of why do you not subscribe to or participate in kinds of change efforts. And I do, while you're doing that, I want to open it up too in terms of addressing the use of terminology, right? That some people might even dismiss this conversation we're having because Josh and I have at least used the term reparative therapy, and some people say, well, what we're doing, for example, at Journey into Manhood, for example, that's not reparative therapy. And reparative therapy is such a polemic word or term that it's not helpful. So, and neither is conversion therapy, and neither is a sexual orientation change effort. Like, so there's many different terms that people would like used here. So I just want to throw that into the conversation while you guys give your answers to why you don't engage in this stuff.
I think one of my answers actually comes to that very argument, the idea that. So I want to preface, I guess, by saying that a lot of the people that engage in these activities are people that I care deeply about. They're good friends. They're great people. They're totally not crazy, and I will sometimes fiercely defend them from being spoken of in maligning terms, right? I talked about how when I kind of got to a point where my same-sex attractions were no longer unwanted, I think as the now non-theist, I think a lot of people are going to find it very easy to just be like, well, then I don't want to do that, because that's what that leads to. I am glad that there are others on the panel that kind of counter that resistance, because this is not the eventual path of everybody who comes to accept this as part of themselves. Most of the people that I actually shared that perspective with are today still very active in the church, and many of them are actually engaged in a lot of these programs. The idea, though, that there's this resistance around, this isn't conversion, this isn't sexual orientation change efforts, this is just personal. Nobody's going in thinking they're going to change their orientation. And that is actually I believe that that's true of many of my friends, that they had enough of a context to understand that probably they weren't going to become straight going into these programs. The problem comes in the fact that in response to, I think it was Sam's op-ed, Rich Weiler, founder of Journey into Manhood, for example, replied and very specifically named the effort as diminishing same-sex attraction. Now, I understand that doesn't have to inherently mean replacing it with heterosexual attraction, but there's also this fundamental paradigm that exists in this world that same-sex attraction isn't necessarily inherently romantic or sexual, and there's all of this very complex, what they would regard as nuance around it. So that's part of why I resist, is because there's so much wordsmithing involved that it sets off some flags for me. I've always been a little cautious of people who are not as direct as I would prefer, I guess. So that's been one big thing for me.
And you call it wordsmithing, and I've experienced it, yes, as wordsmithing on a good day, and on most days,
semantical chaos.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's that. Yeah. Yes. Woeful and intentional, I'll say. Willful and intentional, that it's
lack of candor.
Lack of candor to obscure the truth, really, ultimately. That was my experience. So, but I want to open it up again to Laura and Tom in terms of generally, and we'll go down the road of specifics. But why don't you subscribe to or endorse or support these types of therapies?
Well, let me jump in. I mean, you talked about, do we call it this? Do we call it that? Do we call it reparative therapy? Do we call it sexual orientation change efforts? Conversion therapy? But no, we don't want to call it any of those things. But I go back to, what is the theoretical framework that it comes out of? Because, like Josh, I'm looking at this from both a personal perspective and a professional perspective. And so I know that the theoretical framework that it's based on, no matter what we call it, these ideas, they come out of this idea that either your parents did something at some point, or that you were somehow abused sexually in some way in your formative developmental years. So that's the theoretical framework. You can call it whatever you want, but that is the theoretical framework that it comes out of. And then kind of weaved into that theoretical framework is this idea that your lack of connection and congruence with gender stereotypes, or at least that's the way I see it. Some people say, no, there is this thing that is very static and real in terms of gender, masculinity, femininity, that you must now reconnect to. And so that's a part of that theoretical framework as well. And then kind of overarching is if we solve these things, if we fix them, then you will have some sort of shift to one degree or another from homosexual, to heterosexual, or diminishment in your homosexuality, because your homosexuality, your same-sex attractions are essentially a symptom of what has gone awry. So that's the theoretical framework that all of these things generally come out of.
And if I can you keep going, but just to even sort of put another spin on it, that is the framework, and that the thing that completes the narrative that you're describing is that the thing that then makes us feel like we are gay, but because we're not, according to this framework, we're not really gay, we're all inherently heterosexual, but yet we experience ourselves to have same-sex attraction because, for example, you said we feel this sense of being out of alignment with or incongruence with whatever our true gender is, and in our efforts to seek out and become and obtain and hold and caress our true gender, that manifests itself in a sense of same-sex attraction. But that's all it is we're seeking out a better alignment with our gender. So, anyways, but keep going.
Right. So even if you change that overarching goal of sexual orientation, change the underlying theoretical framework that these ideas, practices comes out of remains. And so then it's like, well, what are we doing? And why would we use that pathway or that framework if it's not in the service of that? And it becomes really, for me, really convoluted as to A, what the goal is, and B, why we're using this particular framework to achieve this very foggy goal. So as a practitioner, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, what we're doing here.
Why?
Because the goal is unclear and the theoretical framework is unsound.
Now, when you say it's unsound,
I'll say it's unsound, it's unsound in terms of from the research currently that we have, there's no positive correlation between parenting styles or abuse with same-sex orientation.
Can you put that in human terms? Positive correlation. What does that mean?
Okay, so it means that there's no connection between the other. Beyond a heterosexual is going to experience those things as much as someone who's homosexual, and so we can't find those connections. They don't manifest themselves in the research, and so from that standpoint, they're unsound. And then after years and years of trying these theoretical frameworks, we're not having how many devoted religious people have run themselves through this gauntlet? We should have so many people coming out and being like, I was once gay and now I'm heterosexual, and you know what I mean? We should have.
Yeah, I feel like I should be pretty straight by now, but
yeah,
not feeling that way.
Yeah.
So there's all those things, and then if we go specifically into the Journey Beyond stuff, it's like then we have to talk about the interventions themselves. So now first we're just talking about the theoretical stuff, but the interventions of, we're going to beat some.
We're going to get there. We're going to get there in a second. I want to hear from Tom, and then that's right where we're going, Laura, is the specifics of the interventions.
So I don't approach it as a therapist. Obviously, that's not my training. So let me as a starting point say people may ask why is this suddenly in the news? Why are we talking about this all of a sudden? And what I would say is that the Jonah trial pierced the veil of secrecy around this stuff. And so there were rumors, but nobody really knew, who wasn't fully engaged in it, what was going on here until the people who are proponents of it, who are fans of it, talked about what really happens in a court of law under oath. And so in that circumstance, we have information about what happens in these settings that certainly I never had before, and I think most other people outside never had. So the second thing I would say is, in terms of my own frame of trying to process this, I'd like to just read quickly a First Presidency letter, which is one of several that have come out over the years, which says, church members should not participate in groups that challenge religious and moral values or advocate unwarranted confrontation with spouse or family members as a means of reaching one's potential. Imitate sacred rites or ceremonies. Foster physical contact among participants. Meet late into the evening or into the early morning hours. Encourage open confession or disclosure of personal information normally discussed only in confidential settings. Cause a husband or wife to be paired with other partners. We strongly counsel against affiliation with any such groups and warn against believing any claim of church approval, tacit or otherwise, by any private organization offering experiential or empowerment training. So if anybody reads through the information about these programs and taking Joseph Smith's counsel that we teach people correct principles and let them govern themselves, it seems to me that there are questions a rational person could ask themselves about every single point that was raised in this letter in terms of testimony given about the two programs that were spoken of.
Tom, what year was that letter? What year was the letter?
So the one I was just reading was 2001. I didn't know that had come out in two versions before that and is reflected in the Handbook of Instructions for leaders in various iterations after that.
I should say, if anybody's listening to this and you want to read anything, for example, the letter that Tom just read, or want to reference anything, we'll have links on the website to all of the information and the groups, and so you can read for yourself. So, Tom, you sort of did take us right into, nice segue into talking about the specific interventions, things that do take place in these settings, like Journey into Manhood and the sort of the graduate level program for that organization, Journey Beyond. And we all have various levels of understanding or knowledge about what does take place there, whether it's through the testimony given on trial or through personal experience like myself, and it sounds like to a degree Josh. So I'll let everybody speak for themselves. So this is the time now where we'll talk about the specific interventions that we know about, that we understand do take place there, and how we feel about them, positive or not so positive. I'll open it up.
Can I, before we jump right into that, because Tom brought in the church's statement, I just wanted to bring into the conversation that the church has also made statements very clearly saying that we should not blame ourselves, our parents, or anybody for our sexual orientation. So that's one point. And even have gone so far to say is that, very, very clearly that, early childhood mischief or sexual abuse should not be, deemed or assumed as responsible. And so,
and when you say mischief, let's be more clear.
Well, that is the words that they use, and so you can interpret that however you want. I think the way it's worded sounds like if you had some early childhood, experience
sexual experimentation,
or if you specifically were abused, it's like, no, that is not the case. And so the church itself has made some really useful statements to address these practices and theories. But it just seems like they haven't integrated into the actual culture of SSA gay Mormons themselves, largely because so many people are accessing these therapies and kind of working within this framework, and there's this dissonance. So I wanted to point that out, and now we can move on.
Yeah, no, but to put a finer point on what you're saying, the church itself has clearly said or disagreed, right? Come out with a clear statement that disagrees with the very foundation, I mean, the fundamental theories upon which these interventions are placed, right? That somehow your parent, for example, hurt you or wounded your sense of gender wholeness in some way that then resulted through a series of events and forces in making you feel like you are gay. And the church itself has said the church does not endorse those philosophies. So
Yeah.
that's one very clear point. Go Jay.
One question is that the same as denouncing those theories? Or was it more of a statement of we don't know and we don't presume to know? Were they kind of leaving it out there for somebody else to figure out, or were they actually actively countering it?
Interestingly, so that statement has been very clear, but then you have a statement, say, on the most recent mormonsandgays.org, where it's like, well, we still don't really know what the origins of this are, so, and we're not saying to necessarily go try to change, but we're not saying don't, and it's just really tentative, kind of leaving it up for the individual, not really addressing directly the fact that most people who are trying to change are using the very frameworks or the theories that they've already spoken out against. So the pieces haven't really been put together in a way that I feel like really kind of strings all of those ideas together clearly.
And I have to say, I mean, just jumping right into and trying to pick up on what's been said, for example, the promise of change. I know that certain individuals who defend these programs have said, well, nobody really holds out that promise for change. And then we heard from Josh saying, in his experiences with the particular things that he engaged in, it was an explicit promise of change. And I have to say, my own personal experience I participated in Journey into Manhood, and I participated in the required, you have to do a couple of conference calls before you go to make sure you're sort of primed and ready and set to manage your expectations or raise your expectations, as the case may be. And I can say with all honesty that in that conversation was a conference call with the director of the organization and a former participant who has returned a few times, where the theme and specifics of that conversation were about how if you apply yourself and make yourself open, which was the catchphrase, stay open to the practices and philosophies, that change can happen. And the director sort of stopped at that, but then allowed space for the expert witness, the former participant, to speak up and share how, and this is a quote, that in his very first weekend, his same-sex attraction, he felt it diminished by 40%. And in subsequent visits, it has diminished almost to the state where he does not feel any. So I experienced it myself, of this holdout and promise of change, diminishment, and even possible eradication of my same-sex attraction. Go, Josh.
I'm like chomping at the bit to say a couple of things. But now, of course, my thoughts will be very scattered and incoherent. But one of the things that you were just mentioning okay, so one of the things that I think that conversion therapy or reparative therapy, or one of the outgrowths of it that can be positive, is attachment. So this is work that is being done with homosexual males specifically, who have felt disenfranchised by maledom in a lot of cases, and who have very, very few male attachments. And of course, there's always that kind of father. So I'm distancing myself right now from this idea of father-son attachment, but more just talking about the fact that we as human beings require attachment in order to feel satisfied in our lives. And so it's taking a population that has, by and large, missed out on or not been able to experience attachment with same gender people because of self-loathing or because of self-disenfranchisement or, for any number of reasons, kind of what Laura,
religious prohibition.
Religious prohibition, precisely. So yeah, not on a friendship level as well as on a romantic level, there are no attachments happening. And what what these programs are then doing is allowing for an experiential situation to be participated in which there is close emotional and in some cases physical contact, which for a very specified period of time, which engenders attachment. And one of the byproducts of attachment that I have discovered in my work, I am a certified sex addiction therapist, and I work largely with a heterosexual population. So most of the time I'm working with straight people. But one of the things that reduces their compulsive sexual behavior most effectively is increasing attachment, both to their spouse if they're married, as well as to same gender peers. So that they experience as they go through that attachment process, they experience, and as they are vulnerable and share and connect, they experience a diminishment or a change in their compulsivity, in the compulsivity of their sexual behaviors. So this is what I see happening here. I see these individuals being brought in, being promised that change will happen, then being given this opportunity to attach, in some cases maybe for the first time ever, and then a direct byproduct of that being that compulsive sexual impulses are changed, are diminished to some degree. And then the languaging, of course, is my sexual orientation is changing because my same gender attractions are diminishing. And so it's the conflation of two very distinct processes, and it's very confusing. And this is why I think we have so many narrative accounts of people who are like, kind of what you were describing, Kendall, like my same gender attractions reduced by 40%, even putting numbers on it. Really what's changing is compulsivity in sexual behavior, not sexual orientation. If you were to corner that person and somehow give them some test in which they had to demonstrate the gender that they were attracted to, if they're male, visually attracted to, I posit that it is totally likely that their sexual orientation is exactly the same, but and that this is simply a reduction in compulsive sexual behavior. So,
and I totally understand that and agree, because and what I'm hearing you say is that the problem arises when, in a program like this, compulsivity, right, being compulsive about our sexual orientation or sexuality or sexual behavior, is being conflated with just the general experience of our sexual orientation, that they are considered one and the same when they are two very importantly distinct things.
That's right.
And I would even add the witness of that. Many of the folks that I participated in, this Journey into Manhood weekend with, in the opening narratives where we would overshare in many cases, I would say, much like the First Presidency cautions us not to. Their narratives, they were very much about a sense of compulsion and the additional layer of shame, because they recognize that this is out of control, and it's, they may not use the word compulsive, but they're describing it as compulsive. So they have this added layer of shame that they want to get rid of. Right? They don't want to feel the shame. They don't want to feel the compulsion underneath it. But in their mind, it's all conflated into, well, this is what it means to be gay, and I don't want to be gay. Yep. So, and exactly as you noted, in those first few hours, even where for the first time, some of these people, and Jay, I want to turn to you as I'm finishing this thought, because you've talked about this, in the first few hours of these experiential weekends, being able to begin to bond with, or even have some sort of social permission to even be around with, bond with, attached to, physically and or emotionally with other men. For some of these people in this program, the first time in their lives, right, that they've ever had this permission and this sense of catharsis and like a thaw, like this emotional thaw that comes over them, and the relaxing of shoulders is such a rewarding experience, right? Like, wow, that's such a positive. Why would I not want that? But again, in my experience, nobody in the room was articulate in the slightest about differentiating what we're talking about here. So, but Jay, you've talked about this in the past about what you witnessed in some of your friends and associates that have experienced a positive experience with these programs, but you are pretty articulate and help in sort of seeing the difference and why they're experiencing this positive experience for the first time in their lives, being able to just say I'm gay in public. So, but maybe I just answered it for you, but
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for, but I'm coming from a place of somebody who's, by and large, my friends loved their experience at Journey into Manhood. They came away feeling very positively about it. They came away feeling like they gained coping skills for various aspects of their lives. They felt like they resolved some shame around it, like for the first time they could be, as they say, authentic around other people without any fear of reprisal. And I think those are all super valuable things. My problem with it is I think you can get those benefits without the imposed narrative and the potential for I participated in a couple of workshops at Evergreen. They actually performed mini gym exercises, and these are super mild and not nearly as intense as the ones I do on the weekends. But one was like standing right in face to face with somebody, inches from each other's faces, and just looking into each other's eyes and holding their gaze for, I think it was like 2 minutes, some ridiculous length of time, which is something that humans don't do normally. We have all kinds of conventions. And so there was something that was very compelling about breaking these conventions. There was something empowering about being able to say, I have done this and I've learned something about myself by doing this exercise. There was another one where you were supposed to say the first word that came to your mind. They're supposed to say, I think it's like woman, and you're supposed to say the first, association exercise of some sort. The problem that I had with it was that we weren't then invited to explore what that meant, but we were told what that meant. And that's a very, very different experience. Now, it can still be beneficial. It can still help you see things. The problem is if I have some kind of an aha moment, and then somebody comes and tells me what that aha moment is about and what the narrative is with that, I'm feeling this amazing cathartic experience without a lot of room to figure out for sure where that's coming from for me. So I don't know if that's getting at what you're talking about, but
yeah, no, exactly. It's perfect. And so Tom and Laura, I want to kind of bring it back around to some of the specifics, interventions that people do, like what you're talking about, Jay, but then much, much deeper. And what your rationale, whether Laura, it's from a personal, professional standpoint, or Tom, how you reference the counsel given by our church leaders, of why some of the specifics that things that are done don't seem advisable. And feel free to get specific and go to town. We don't have too much time left, but
right. Okay, we're jumping in.
Yeah.
So I should maybe preface in saying, I've been a group therapist for about a decade, so I'm kind of seeing everything through that lens. And I kind of geek out on like the ethics of my profession. But it's not a hazy ethical question when we start talking about nudity with clients as a practitioner. That was a very short conversation in Law and Ethics class 101. But since kind of engaging with the knowledge that nudity is involved in, specifically in Journey Beyond, and then has kind of been a part of some of the subgroups that are kind of loosely associated with this kind of movement, for lack of a better word. Try to put myself in that headspace from the practitioner's angle, right? There's no women's equivalent of this stuff. You know, and what would it be to kind of, you know, coalesce or invite, you know, women who I know have same-sex attraction into some sort of retreat where at any point we are nude together. It is like I can't get myself there. It's
Now
so
let me push
foreign.
back on you though. But
Yeah.
so are you saying no nudity is ever okay with members of your same sex? Because you know we hear stories that in the old days, the brethren of the church swam naked at the Deseret Gym, for example. That's an example that's been held
Right.
out.
And I think
So
those incidences are all kind of happening in the context of nobody even acknowledging the reality of homosexuals. That, you know, because we don't have any historic context in the church of people who are of the opposite genders coming together to be naked with one another in any sort of therapeutic or something kind of way. So there's not a good analogy anywhere culturally for us. So culturally, it's definitely outside of where we come from as Mormons.
to put a finer point on what you said, naked swimming at Deseret Gym, as an example, um, was not done in the service of trying to diminish somebody consciously in the service of trying to diminish somebody's same-sex attraction. So completely different purposes and contexts for this nudity. So just want to put a finer point on that.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, so that's one element, and then the other element of, you know, the other thing that's really stood out in terms of interventions has been, of course, the you know, beating a parent or a former abuser in effigy, particularly the parent element of it, and because like Jay pointed out, this idea that the individual is given a set script or a set narrative or a set idea, like your parent is the cause of this, therefore you must do this. That is not an open-ended sound therapeutic practice. That doesn't come out of a place of insight. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, so I actually fully agree with that. The thing that I keep getting when I express that, and I don't always have a good way of responding, is that's why these aren't for everyone, right? That's the thing that I keep getting pushback on. Well, that's why this isn't for everyone, and that's why this is a self-selected group that have elected to do this because they fit the description on the website and they identify with some of the principles that are put forth, and for them, they say it fits. So why should I, an observer, impose upon them to say, hey, this was imposed on you, when they're saying, but it fit, it made sense, it clicked for me? I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I do have some ideas, but I want to hear yours.
And I resonate with that as well, Jay, in that, yeah, if it does genuinely fit, who are we to say that doesn't fit and, you know, you're wrong? But very, as quickly as humanly possible, I will say that the reason that doesn't hold across the board, even when they say, oh, but it fit for the people that participated, no. The way that I experienced them to impose that was when in a moment where the director of the Journey into Manhood weekend picked out somebody and basically went through a process to help them decide where it was at the moment in their life when their father had hurt them and their sense of masculinity, and imposed it on him. He literally said, that's it, that's the moment. It wasn't the individual saying, I feel like this was the moment. In fact, the individual said, I don't think there was a moment because I like my dad. But again, he went with it. But in that moment of going with it, the director said, well, does this fit for you? And he said, literally was like, I guess, because there was so much weighing on him in terms of motivation and why he was there and why he had to make this work. He went with it. He's like, all right, I'll keep playing the game and subscribing to this narrative you just literally thrust on me, because it's all in the service of that end goal, because you're going to make the gay go away, right? So that's the way in which somebody could say, well, that the narrative fit him, so who are you to take it away? I'm like, you had to be there for the moment when the narrative fit him. It was forced on him. But anyway.
That's part of why, and I don't want to monopolize because I feel like I'm robbing Laura of some time, but that's part of my personal narrative of, because I was actually pretty open to some of these ideas. That's why I went to the workshop when I was at the Evergreen conference, and I wanted to hear it from them themselves. I didn't want to make my decision whether to go or not based on other people's hearsay, but part of one thing that really put me off was when I did have friends who didn't have positive experiences. They either had neutral or they had negative experiences, and there was a lot of, well, they didn't commit to the process. They didn't put what they needed to put in. I was there. They weren't being vulnerable. They weren't sharing what they needed to share. They weren't they weren't putting into the process what they needed to get out of it what they needed to, and that's why it wasn't a positive experience for them. There's just a lot of blaming the patient in order to protect the product is how I felt it was, and that was very hurtful just to me as a friend. I can only imagine what it was like to be one of those people in that position. I don't think that's the majority of people, but it was a couple of my friends, enough that other people that I knew to be otherwise really kind and good people were being very dismissive of them, and that bothered me, I guess.
That was absolutely what I was charged with repeatedly, that I was not giving myself over to, I wasn't opening myself up to the degree where there were some moments when I was challenged by it. I said, I literally don't know how to be more open. I am here, I am listening, I'm letting you touch me with certain limitations to do your thing. I don't know how to be more open, and yet it was always blaming the patient of, well, you're not doing it enough. Okay. So, Tom, I want to go to you. You read the letter from the First Presidency, and it was in the context of these begin to enumerate or describe reasons why for you these sorts of practices don't seem advisable to you. But I would like you to take a couple of minutes to get more specific.
And I guess it aligns with my experience of having been a gay man in a committed relationship for nearly a couple of decades, and with non-church friends as our primary kind of social group for most of those years. But the common narrative in gay land is that men are incapable of being faithful. And so when you have two men together in a gay relationship, before you even begin, by definition, it's impossible to have a monogamous relationship. And some people feel politically it's not a desirable thing, that this is some horrible thing foisted off on us by earlier generations or whatever. But even for those who say, no, this is meaningful to me, and I want to make that commitment to my partner, and I want to have the commitment back in return. And it's like, no, it's just, you're crazy. It's not even possible. And it always made me a little nuts, having lived that commitment and knowing a lot of other people who were living it as well, that somehow, is this view that it's just not even real. You can't even present it or talk about it or even hold it out there as a desirable objective. And I've sort of felt like in some of this conversation feels a little surreal and a little crazy making to me in the same way, which is if as Laura was trying to do, we say, look, let's think about this in the context of the straight world. If one of my brothers goes home to his wife and says, hey, I didn't really bind to my mother, and I need more connection with women in my life. So, we're going to have some women come over to the house, and, I'm going to go spend some long weekends away, and, we'll be naked, but there won't be any sex. But I really need to have a lot of this connection. I guarantee you, I don't have a sister-in-law who's going to say, sure, you go right ahead. That sounds great to me. The answer would be no way, Jose. And so it just seems sort of surreal to me that what I think any people that I talk to in of my straight friends and say, how would this feel to you? Is just such a non-starter, and yet somehow, yet again, we're supposed to be different as gay people, right? That somehow the rules don't apply to us, or our circumstance is so different that you can't compare it to a similar analogy in the straight world. And I think that's bogus. I think the rules do apply, whether you're having sex or not. It's that, are you building relationships that are appropriate in terms of commitments you've made to other people?
In response to that, I think that is spot on, and I think that that's what we see happening. Like many of you, there are people that I know that have had what they describe as really wonderful experiences participating in these kinds of situations. To the point where years ago, 8 or 9 years, I never did experience it, but I totally considered it because people I trusted had said that it was such a valuable experience and so moving and so powerful. But in my years, as I've gotten older and in my years as a clinician, what I feel like I've seen happening is a lot of these individuals, and I'm generalizing, so there's going to be lots of exceptions, but many of these individuals end up having a very positive attachment experience in these events, and then they get home and they are not able to duplicate that attachment in normal, healthy, standard ways with people in their lives. So then they either begin to staff these events, or they try to reunite with the individuals that they were in this experience with, so that they can continue to have those attachment bonds that they had formed, which I think is noble and kind of sweet and completely human, and not a bad thing to do. My contention is that is an ineffective coping mechanism, that's not a sustainable way to deal with the need for same-sex friendship or same-sex connection. What you actually need is same-sex friendships and connection with real people in your life. And then if you have a real friend and real time that you go to the gym with, and there's nudity in that experience, that is contextually appropriate because there is a normal relationship happening there. Or if you have a really deep, intimate conversation with this person, and he puts his arm around your shoulder or whatever, there's legitimate closeness happening within the context of a legitimate, sustainable, real relationship. And so I think that's what these programs are attempting to achieve, and it's just not sustainable in the long term, and you kind of see that in people.
Right.
But,
And so,
Josh, we're all doing this. We're all like,
exactly. So we literally only have a couple of minutes left, and so I don't know what to do. So Chase,
Can I take 30
I'm
seconds
talking to you. Chase, I'm talking to you. So Chase, we're gonna figure. We have to literally stop. We have to have a quick little conference. What do you guys want to do? Because we have 3 minutes left. So
Can I take 30 seconds of it, then give the rest to Laura?
Laura, can you do it in 3 minutes?
no, I want a part 3
I was
sometime.
just saying, or should we do
I do
part
too.
3?
Yeah, there's too much to jump into.
Because what I was going to go into was actually tying all of that together, but then the nudity and the comparisons.
Because I still want to get to my question of like, okay, great, but there's that big, huge emotional, ethical pushback of how dare you guys take away the one thing that's helping me keep my covenants. We haven't gotten there yet.
And that's
Right.
what I want to talk about. I mean, anyway.
So
In a quick sense. Anyway.
Okay,
Well,
but
I could speak to what Josh was just saying.
which is great. So, but for me, the question on the table is: do we do a part 3?
Not
I think we
tonight.
do a part 3. We just love the sound of our own voices.
Yeah. So
I can probably do a summary version of what I was going to say in 90 seconds, but
okay, so
can we see if we if people can contain it within the 3 minutes, and then
so that's
and
what
then
we'll
decide?
do. It's like I'll give us another. Literally, it's 3 minutes
Mm-hmm.
of wrap up, and we all know that that's what it is, and then we will address the part 3. Just knowing that obviously we've got a lot more to talk about, because I do want to talk about that whole other question. So,
And I do think, by the way, that we should review the first 2.
yeah,
And have our colleagues in the whole group review the first 2, and then talk about, okay, what needs to be said in a part 3 that hasn't been said, or in a different direction, so that everybody has some helpful comments.
I don't know that that's necessary. That seems like a long process.
well, because in terms of I know what we need to do for part 3, but So yeah, we will encourage.
Well, then we're done.
We will encourage the rest of the group, of course, to weigh in, absolutely. But I don't know that it needs to be dependent on. It all depends on the timing. You know what I mean, in terms of the pacing of the edit, when these are released, because that's a whole other issue we have to talk about.
Well,
Same time or different weeks.
Yeah,
Right.
we're pushing out other people's
Right.
schedule, which is fine by me. But
Right. So we have to put that to the group. That's the
I mean,
question.
Mormon Stories releases like 53-part podcast, right? So,
Yeah. Ugh. So okay, so I'm setting the clock at 4 minutes, which is generous. And we'll start with Tom.
Okay.
And then I'm not going to call on anybody. You guys,
Okay.
I'm just going to say, and time is up, and we got to go. So that's all I'm going to say. So you guys go for it. So starting the clock now, go Tom.
So Josh, it strikes me listening to you say that isn't one of the possible answers to this that if words and stakes were great at being open and welcoming and loving, so nobody has to hide who they are there, isn't that a place where these real relationships would form?
Yes, and should form quorums. The idea for men, the idea of quorums should be that ideally. But yeah. What were you, Laura? Were you going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, the whole time you were speaking, I was going, yes. But then at the same time, I was going, but the social context for which people could actually access what you're talking about has only begun to start to evolve in that healthy direction to where people could access that. I mean, these groups essentially simulate coming out in an accepting context. Mm. That's what they simulate. And it feels so good. Mm-hmm. But then for people to translate that experience into their everyday lives, which as a group therapist, that is the whole goal. Mm-hmm. The goal for me is to get my clients to have an experience from which they grow, and then they take that experience and they replicate it in their everyday life. But in the Mormon social context that's had, and a lot of social context, it's not just Mormons, right? Mm-hmm. That have been, so homophobic and so many misunderstandings, and we're discouraging people from coming out. We're discouraging people from saying, that about themselves. And there's so many social risks and costs just to saying that about oneself and your status in the community, that what you have, what you want to gain and what you will probably lose, the risks have been so high. And so we can say, yes, this is what people should have been doing all along. But in reality, that has been so hard for people to access. And we have to acknowledge that. That's fair.
Yes, and we have some work to do.
Yeah, we all have some work to do.
What do you have to say, Jay?
I think that's spot on. I have a whole other conversation I could probably start, but when I referred to some of the things that I did earlier on to try to adjust or whatever, locker room anxiety, for example, I do have to say, being exposed to nudity helped. There was something about that needed to be resolved. It got resolved, and yet it was a real world experience. And I was lucky enough to have a straight friend from my senior year of high school on, who's a really good friend. And we really connected, and that was meaningful to me, and that was helpful to me in a lot of ways that I think actually a lot of people get from things like Journey to Manhood and some of those approaches. It didn't make me straight, but it certainly made me better able to connect with other guys and feel comfortable with myself where I was. And, I just really, I sympathize with that process because I've been through some of that. And maybe part of why I didn't go was because I felt like I'd been through that in real life. Now, what conflicted LDS kid is going to look at me and think I want to do what he did? So if the people he's looking at are all doing Journey to Manhood or other things, what is out there? What's the alternative? What is out there for them? What are they looking to? Can they create that in real life like I did?
And that will be the last word for today. But that is the next question. And so for our listeners, please know that we will continue this conversation, picking up literally on that question of, okay, so if what we're talking about, these different programs are not, in our opinion, nor the opinion of most mental health associations, the best response to being gay and Mormon and managing that experience, what are what are the alternatives? And that will be another conversation for another day. So we want to thank all of us for participating. Thank you all for listening. And we will see you next time on Out in Zion.
Thanks.